Imagine being told your worth could be decided in a single dance. One waltz, one moment, one chance to prove you belong or to be mocked forever. That was the cruel tradition in the world of the Hawthorns, a family of immense wealth and influence. Their heir, Richard, stood at the center of every society gathering, while his mother, Eleanor, watched with cold, calculating eyes. For decades, their ballroom wasn't just a place for music and elegance, it was an arena where reputations were built and destroyed. But one night, something happened that no one expected. A challenge was issued, a line was drawn, and a woman the world had overlooked stepped into the spotlight. She wasn't a debutante, nor the daughter of a powerful man. She was the maid who scrubbed their floors, the outsider no one thought belonged. And yet, when the music began, she revealed a secret that turned the entire world of the wealthy upside down. This is the story of a single waltz, and how it shattered the walls of arrogance, prejudice, and pride. The Hawthorne estate towered, like a monument to privilege. On this particular evening, the mansion glowed brighter than ever before, its grand ballroom filled with dignitaries, investors, and women dressed in gowns that shimmered like liquid silver. The chandeliers glittered, the orchestra tuned their instruments, and anticipation hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. At the heart of it all stood Eleanor Hawthorne. She was a woman both admired and feared, her presence as sharp as the diamonds around her neck. Every guest knew the unspoken rule. This wasn't just a party, it was a stage. Richard Hawthorne, her only son and heir, was expected to choose wisely. From the young women, Eleanor paraded before him. But there was more to it than courtship. The tradition Eleanor upheld was simple, yet merciless. Any woman who could not dance the waltz of acceptance with grace would be dismissed, ridiculed, and forgotten. A single misstep wasn't just embarrassing, it was social exile. That night, whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Rumor had it Eleanor had raised the stakes. Not only would the dance reveal grace and composure, but this time, the prize was more than approval, it was marriage. Whoever passed Eleanor's judgment would be bound to Richard, and through him, to the empire the Hawthorns controlled. The orchestra struck its first notes, the polished floor gleaming like glass. Young women took their turns, one by one, carefully, guided by Richard, who wore the charm of a man trained to lead, but not necessarily to feel. Some faltered within seconds. Others managed to glide through, only to be dismissed with a thin, icy smile from Eleanor. The air grew heavier with every attempt. Guests leaned closer, eyes sharp, whispers sharper. Who would pass? Who would fail? And when would Eleanor finally be satisfied? Then, something unexpected happened. In a moment that would later be recounted in hushed tones and embellished stories, Eleanor's voice carried through the ballroom like a blade. She issued a challenge not to the daughters of wealthy bankers or aristocrats, but to someone no one even considered worthy of standing on that floor. The maid. She had been working quietly in the background all evening, pouring drinks, clearing plates, invisible to the room of jewels and silk. But Eleanor's eyes had caught her, and whether out of cruelty, arrogance, or a twisted sense of amusement, she called her forward. Gasps echoed across the room. A maid, to dance with Richard. It was unthinkable, laughable, even insulting. The thick, wealthy guests exchanged smirks, certain the poor woman would stumble and collapse under the weight of humiliation. It would be entertainment, a reminder of who belonged, and who did not. But what no one knew, what even Eleanor herself did not know, was that this maid carried a secret. She was not just a servant. She was a dancer, a champion in her own right, hidden away by circumstance, her talent buried under years of scrubbing floors and polishing silver. And as the orchestra prepared to play once more, she stepped onto the floor. Head held high, eyes steady, as if the mocking stares around her were nothing but shadows. The music began, and with it, so did a story that would forever change the legacy of the Hawthorns. The first notes of the waltz rang out, delicate and deliberate, echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the Hawthorne ballroom. Every eye was fixed on the floor, not out of admiration, but anticipation of failure. The wealthy guests leaned forward, as though waiting for a spectacle, their fans fluttering and their jeweled fingers tightening on champagne glasses. For them, this was theater. The thought of a maid attempting a dance meant for nobility was outrageous, even comical. A few whispered behind their gloved hands, their words sharp with malice. Others chuckled openly, confident that the poor woman would falter before the first turn. But then, something shifted. The maid, whose name few even bothered to know, placed her hand in Richard's with an elegance that stunned the room into silence. Her movements were not stiff, not hesitant, but deliberate, almost regal. Her back was straight, her chin lifted. She moved as though she belonged there, as though this floor had been waiting for her. Richard, trained in the dance since childhood, felt it immediately. She wasn't following his lead clumsily, as so many before had done. No, she was guiding him, subtly, effortlessly, weaving herself into the music, as if the orchestra played only for her. The gasps began almost imperceptibly, growing louder with each step. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into disbelief. Who was she? How could a servant move with the precision of an artist? Eleanor's smile faded into something sharper, colder. At first, she had expected humiliation, a spectacle to remind everyone of her power. But what she witnessed instead was control slipping through her fingers. The maid was not stumbling. She was not trembling. She was shining. And as the waltz carried on, she revealed her secret. Every spin was flawless. Every glide across the polished floor seamless. Her timing was impeccable. Her grace undeniable. She did not simply dance the waltz, she became it. The ballroom that had once mocked her now watched in awe, caught between disbelief and admiration. What the crowd could not have known was that years before she donned a maid's apron, she had been a dancer of renown. She had trained tirelessly, won competitions, and lived for the stage. But life, with its cruel twists, had forced her to abandon the spotlight. Tragedy and circumstance had pulled her from glory and pressed her into servitude. Yet here she was, reclaiming the very skill that once defined her, in the most unlikely of places. As the orchestra swelled, something extraordinary happened. The crowd grew restless, not with laughter, but with unease. For in every perfect step she took, the invisible walls of status and privilege cracked. Each movement challenged the very order the Hawthorns had built their reputation on. Richard, too, was changed in those moments. He had danced with countless women, all of them proper, polished, and rehearsed, but none had made him feel the rhythm like this. None had carried such strength, such authenticity. For the first time, his role as heir felt insignificant compared to the presence of the woman who danced beside him. And Eleanor, she watched, her face a mask of cold calculation. What began as cruel amusement now burned into something else, fear. This was no harmless performance. This was a threat. If the maid finished this waltz without flaw, Eleanor's carefully curated hierarchy would unravel. The ballroom would remember this night, not for Eleanor's control, but for the triumph of the one she had tried to belittle. The music rose to its crescendo. Guests held their breath. And as the final notes rang out, the maid completed the dance with a flourish so breathtaking that even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer brighter in her honor. For a moment, there was silence. Not the silence of scorn, but the silence of disbelief. Then, a sound no one expected filled the air. Applause. Tentative at first, but growing louder, echoing through the gilded walls of the ballroom. The maid had not only danced, she had conquered, yet victory, as sweet as it seemed, was fragile, because for Eleanor Hawthorne, applause meant nothing. Her pride had been wounded, her authority challenged, and in that wound grew a quiet, dangerous resolve. The waltz had ended, but the real battle had only just begun. The ballroom still buzzed with energy from the maid's triumph, though most tried to mask it behind polite chatter and carefully measured expressions. No one dared voice what they were truly thinking, that a servant had outshone them all. But the air itself carried the weight of it, and Eleanor Hawthorne could feel it pressing down on her shoulders. This was supposed to have been her victory, a humiliating display to remind the staff, and her son, of their place. Instead, it had turned into a humiliation of her own making. She had invited mockery, but it was she who now teetered on the edge of ridicule. Eleanor's smile returned, but it was no longer the smile of a hostess. It was the mask of a woman who had tasted defeat and vowed never to let it linger. Behind her jeweled eyes, schemes began to take shape. The maid had revealed herself as more than a servant. Worse, she had captivated Richard. Eleanor had seen it in his expression during the dance, the subtle awe, the silent admiration. She knew her son, knew the way he carried himself with indifference toward most women. But here, with every step of the waltz, he had seemed alive in a way she had not seen in years. That could not be allowed. For Eleanor, it was not simply about pride. It was about control, about the order of things. Her wealth, her reputation, her influence all depended on maintaining clear boundaries between those who served and those who were served. A crack in that wall could spread quickly, and soon, her entire empire would be questioned. And so, even as the applause echoed faintly, she whispered to herself a promise. The maid would be reminded of her place. The following days were heavy with tension. The staff moved through the mansion with hushed voices, aware of the storm brewing in their mistress's silence. Eleanor did not lash out immediately. She was too clever for that. Instead, she began her work quietly, like a spider weaving its web. She started with the whispers. Small comments here and there, designed to plant seeds of doubt among the guests who had been present. Wasn't it odd, she suggested, that a maid could dance so perfectly? Did it not seem suspicious, perhaps even improper, that she had once trained so intimately in such arts? And what sort of woman, Eleanor hinted, allowed herself to perform in such a way before men of standing? Whispers grew into rumors, and rumors into shadows that followed the maid. Through every corridor, what had been applause quickly twisted into suspicion. Some claimed she had deceived them. Others said she must have stolen her skills from another. A few even questioned her morals, as though grace on the dance floor could be mistaken for impropriety. But Eleanor was not satisfied with rumors alone. She needed something more tangible, something to crush the maid entirely. Her opportunity came when she discovered an old detail from the maid's past. Years ago, in another city, she had not only competed but won in professional competitions, victories that had been celebrated, even written about in newspapers. What to the maid had once been pride, Eleanor now twisted into shame. She spread word that the maid had once lived above her station, pretending to be something she was not, only to fall into disgrace. To Eleanor's allies, this became proof that the maid was untrustworthy, ambitious, even dangerous. And yet, no matter how many threads she pulled, Eleanor could not shake one truth. Richard was drawn closer, while others believed the rumors. Richard seemed to grow only more intrigued. To him, the maid's past was not scandal, but proof of her resilience. She had tasted success, lost it, and still carried herself with dignity. He admired her strength, her courage, her refusal to cower even as the weight of gossip pressed down on her. This, more than anything, stoked Eleanor's fury. For every scheme she set in motion, her son seemed to drift further from her grasp. The house became a battlefield, though no words were spoken openly. Glances became weapons, silence became strategy, and every day the invitations went out weeks in advance, gilded with gold and sealed with Eleanor Hawthorne's crest. This was to be the social event of the season, or so the whispers said. Politicians, business magnates, and old family dynasties all were summoned to the estate for an evening of elegance. But behind the grandeur of Eleanor's preparations was a darker motive. This was not about celebration. It was about spectacle, and in Eleanor's mind, the maid would be the centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated downfall. The ballroom was transformed once more, brighter and grander than before. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations, and violins filled the air with melodies that seemed spun from silk. Guests arrived in carriages that glittered beneath the lanterns lining the driveway, stepping into the mansion with an anticipation that bordered on reverence. They did not know that their hostess had designed the evening not to delight, but to destroy. The maid worked quietly that day, as she always did, her presence humble, yet unshakable. She had heard the rumors Eleanor had planted, felt the sharp edge of whispers that lingered in the halls. Still, she carried herself with grace, refusing to let the poison seep into her soul. She had survived worse. She had seen triumph and ruin before, and she knew that dignity was its own form of resistance. But Eleanor was determined to strip even that away. As the orchestra played, Eleanor's plan began to unfold. She had arranged a subtle challenge, an unspoken expectation that the maid would once again be asked to dance. But this time, it would not be a private humiliation among a select few. It would be a test before the entire city's elite, with no room for error, no margin for dignity. The whispers spread quickly through the room. Will she dance again? The anticipation grew. Some were curious, others skeptical, and many secretly eager to see whether the maid would stumble. Richard, of course, stood near his mother, his eyes scanning the crowd with quiet unease. He knew his mother too well. He could sense that beneath her smile was a sharpened blade, but he did not yet know how she intended to use it. When at last Eleanor lifted her glass and spoke, her voice cut through the air like a knife. With a graciousness that barely masked her malice, she praised the evening, thanked her distinguished guests, and then, as if it were a passing thought, she turned her gaze to the maid. Her words were honeyed, but her meaning was venom. She commanded the maid to step forward once more, to bless the evening with the very talent that had so surprised them all. The room fell silent, every eye turned toward the maid, and in that silence, the trap was sprung. If she refused, it would confirm the rumors that she had deceived them, that she was ashamed, that she had no right to stand where she did. But if she accepted, she would step into a spotlight designed to burn her, surrounded by critics eager to find a flaw. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The maid stood still, her hands folded gently before her, her face calm though her heart pounded. She knew this was no invitation. It was a trial. Eleanor's eyes gleamed, certain that her prey had been cornered. And yet, in that silence, the maid remembered. She remembered the long hours of practice in hidden studios, the cheers of crowds who once celebrated her victories, the rhythm of music that had been her companion when the world had turned cold. She remembered that before she was a servant, she had been a dancer, and no one, not Eleanor, not whispers, not fear, could take that from her. She stepped forward, the orchestra readied itself, and the first notes filled the air. The crowd leaned in, expectant, hungry for spectacle. Eleanor's smile widened, convinced that at last the maid would falter. But what followed was not faltering, it was transcendence. Every movement, every turn, every lift of her arms spoke of grace and strength forged in fire. The maid did not simply dance, she told a story with her body, one of survival, of defiance, of beauty that no amount of scorn could erase. The crowd, who had entered the night with doubt, now watched in rapt silence. Some gasped, others leaned forward as though afraid to miss a single step. Richard's heart swelled with pride. In that moment, he saw her not as a servant, not as a victim of gossip, but as a woman who had risen above them all. And Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was not the failure she had orchestrated. This was something else entirely. When the final note lingered in the air and the maid came to a stillness, the silence broke. The applause lingered long after the music faded, echoing through the halls of the Hawthorne estate like a judgment passed down by fate itself. What had begun as a trap had transformed into a coronation. The maid, who had once moved quietly through these rooms, carrying trays and sweeping floors, now stood at the center of a storm she had mastered. Guests surged forward, eager to praise her, their words spilling out in awe. A champion, they whispered, a marvel. Some admitted they remembered her name from competitions long past, connecting the woman before them to headlines they had once read but forgotten. Others confessed their shame at doubting her, and in every face she saw not pity, but respect. Richard, standing a step behind her, no longer hesitated. He moved to her side openly, no longer the timid heir, fearful of his mother's disapproval. His pride was unshaken, his eyes fixed on her as if she were the only person in the room. But at the edge of this storm sat Eleanor Hawthorne, her glass untouched, her smile long vanished. She had lost control, and worse, she had lost face. The whispers that now spread through the room were not about the maid's supposed shame, but about Eleanor's cruelty. Guests who had once envied her position now saw the cracks in her empire. Her attempt to humiliate had become her own undoing. She rose, her movements sharp, and excused herself with a brittle grace. But no excuse could mend what had been broken. Power, after all, is fragile, and once its illusion is shattered, it rarely returns. For the maid, however, the night had just begun. She felt no triumph in Eleanor's downfall, no satisfaction in revenge. Her heartbeat was something far greater. Freedom. For too long she had been bound by circumstance, reduced to her station, dismissed because of her skin, her past, her place in the world. But tonight had proven what she had always known, that worth is not given by others, it is claimed. As the orchestra shifted into a softer melody, Richard extended his hand, and though words were not spoken, the gesture was clear. This was not an invitation born of pity, nor an obligation imposed by wealth or name. It was a choice, offered freely. She accepted. And so, before the crowd that had once doubted her, they danced. It was not the dance Eleanor had imagined, staged for mockery and control. This was something new. A waltz not of humiliation, but of renewal, a declaration that love and respect cannot be dictated by cruelty, nor confined by expectation. The crowd watched in silence at first, then with smiles, then with tears. What they witnessed was not scandal, but grace, not rebellion, but destiny. The night ended not with whispers of shame, but with applause that rang into the early hours. Applause that followed the maid long after the last carriage departed. In the weeks that followed, rumors still circled, as they always do. Some clung to old prejudices, unwilling to accept what they had seen, but most spoke of her as a symbol, a woman who had risen from service to sovereignty, who had reminded them that greatness wears no single face, no single title. Richard and the maid's bond grew stronger, no longer hidden in shadows but carried in the open light. Their union was not the fairy tale Eleanor had wanted to orchestrate, but it was truer, deeper, forged not in manipulation but encouraged. As for Eleanor, she faded from her throne of influence, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. She had gambled everything on control and lost to the one thing she could not break, dignity. And so, the story that began with a challenge meant to destroy ended with a waltz that redefined everything. A waltz that turned mockery into majesty, that reclaimed a woman's voice, that bound two souls together against the weight of a world determined to keep them apart. Because sometimes, the cruelest traps lead to the most unexpected triumphs. And sometimes, the waltz you are forced to dance becomes the very step that carries you into freedom.